Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. So in today's video, I wanted to share with all of you my initial impressions of the Pat McGrath Decadence Palette. So this is Mothership IV, and this is a fairly unique palette in that it's actually all shimmers. So there are different formulas of shimmers, but there are no mattes in this, and also none of her Blitz Astral formulas. So I think when this first released, it was just a limited edition release, but it was really popular, and she brought it back in Star Wars packaging, and then later on she made it part of the permanent collection. So here it is in the permanent collection black lacquer packaging. And if you guys watched my Pat McGrath Subversive video, you know that I bought this as part of Pat McGrath's 25% off sale, but I was pretty sketched out with this Lapis Luxury shade. So I don't know if you guys can see clearly in the camera, but there are these little bubbles in the formula. And I reached out to the Pat McGrath customer service team, and they said that this is just sometimes what happens when the product is kind of drying down. So I think it's technically safe to use, but I'll be returning this palette because I just really don't like that sort of texture, and it still creeps me out that there are literally just these like bubbles in my eyeshadow. So I haven't decided yet whether I want to get a replacement for this or whether I just want to return this. I think eventually I will want to collect all of the Pat McGrath palettes, but I am a little bit worried that if I get a replacement now, maybe it'll have the same issue in case it's like a batch problem. So I don't know. Part of the reason I'm filming this video today is I just want to, further formulate my thoughts about whether I actually want this palette in my life now versus whether it's okay to wait a little while and get it later on when hopefully they have a batch that doesn't have this bubbling issue. So for today's video, I'll be doing some swatches and also trying out a look of this palette on my face. Hopefully this video is helpful in case you guys are looking into Pat McGrath palettes and curious about this one here. So without further ado, let's get into the swatches. So I'm going to swatch these guys left to right, top to bottom. Here are the first three shades. So first off, we have Gold Standard. And this is actually a shade that I already have in my collection as part of her 18 pan Mothership Celestial palette that she released for the holiday season. So this is a really pretty sort of 24 karat gold, really your standard yellow gold shade. Personally, not one I'm super excited about just because I already have the shade, but if you don't have the shade and you like yellow golds, this is a really gorgeous option. Next, we have Inferno, which is this really pretty peachy orange metallic shade. So this is a really smooth formula with more of a satin metallic rather than a really shimmery metallic shade. Next, we have Blue Blood, which I think she released in one of her quads for the holiday season. So if you already have that one, then this will be a repeat shade. But I don't have that quad, so I'm excited about this shade because I think it's just such a beautiful and unique shade. It's a burgundy satin metallic that's quite deep and rich in tone. And given that this palette doesn't have any mattes, I think this shade is really great as a replacement for a matte shade. Next up, we have Sinful, which is a more shimmery metallic shade. So you can definitely see this has higher shine than the previous two shades. And this is quite an interesting sort of platinum metallic shade with a slight bit of green to it. So I find this quite intriguing. I don't know that it's the most flattering shade ever, but I think it's really interesting and definitely quite different from other gold shades. Next, we have Underworld, which is this really pretty deep blue satin metallic shade. So this has a really dark base to it, and I think also can be used in lieu of a matte. So now we're going into the second row, and the first shade we have is Sterling, which is a gorgeous silver shade. So this is very high shine, very metallic, and kind of your typical gray silver shade. Next we have Lapis Luxury, which is unfortunately the shade that has the bubbles. So I just took a tiny bit of it on my finger because I really didn't want to touch the bubbles too much. But there you can see this is one of the most beautiful shades in the palette in my opinion. It's a very unique aqua shade with a gorgeous shimmer to it. So part of why I really didn't want to keep this palette in particular is because since this is such a gorgeous shade, I want to make sure I can actually use it. Next we have Divine Mink, which is a really unique shade. So this is also quite deep, similar to Underworld, but it has more of a brownie, almost lilac lilac tone to it. So I think this is a really gorgeous shade, and I don't have anything similar to this in my collection currently. It sort of rests between gray, silver, lilac, and brown. So really beautiful shade. And now we have the last two shades, first of which is Hedonistic, and this is actually a dual chrome shade. So it has a nice flip from kind of orange to red to gold. So it's really, really pretty and looks much more interesting on the lids than it might look in pan. In pan, I think it looks just like a standard red shade, but it actually is quite multi-dimensional. And then finally, we have Enigma, which is a really pretty silvery taupe shade. So if you're into one and done shadow looks, I feel like this would be really excellent for that. It's neutral enough to use on an everyday basis, but I think also paired with these other shades can create quite a unique look. So there we are with all of the shades, and this is such a pretty palette if you like the idea of having a palette that's sort of like a treasure box with a lot of metal shades like golds and silvers and platinums, but also with a lot of gemstone shades, so kind of your ruby, sapphire types of shades. It doesn't read purely gemstone. Each of these is a little bit more unique than that, so you can create some looks that are really different than what you can with whatever you already have in your collection. That said, I would say that this is probably one of the least user-friendly Pat McGrath palettes in that you don't have your mattes, you don't have your glitter toppers, so you just have a lot of shades that kind of all go in different directions. And so if you're a first-time Pat McGrath palette collector, I don't think this is necessarily the best place to start out. I would say definitely collect some of her other palettes and then use this as sort of a palette to bring in some more pops of color or just, you know, a bit more interest to a look that you would create with your other palettes. So without further ado, let's get into the makeup look today. And speaking of other palettes, because this doesn't have any mattes in it, I'm actually going to bring out my Pat McGrath Subliminal palette to draw from some of the mattes here just so we can have a nice base for all of these metallic pigments. So starting out with my Wayne Goss number 16, I'm going to go into this Ultimate Taupe shade just to sort of set my eye primer and just add a little bit of color to the crease area so all the other shades can just blend in more seamlessly. And you can see this doesn't really look like much on my lids, but I found that just laying this down initially does a lot to just ensure that the rest of the shadows blend more seamlessly. So now I'm going to take some of Depth just to add a little bit more shade, because as you can tell, Ultimate Taupe was quite light, and this is going to be a pretty smoky look today, so I just want to lay down enough mattes to help provide a base. Okay, so not a perfect blend by any means, but it's okay. We're going to cover this all up with a lot of shimmers. So let's go ahead now into Blue Blood and see how that works just on top of all of these existing shades as a crease shade. So I'm using my same Wayne Goss number 16 brush and just trying to lightly layer this in the outer portion of the crease area. And I would say this is layering quite well. Pat McGrath's metallic shades definitely blend out quite nicely, so I think that you can definitely use these in lieu of mattes, but if you do what I do today and have some mattes down already, it might just help a little bit with your blend. All right, so we already have a decent amount of smoke going, but why don't we go in now with some Divine Mink just to sort of further define the outer portion of the eyes. And this is actually more shimmery, I would say, than Blue Blood. So it's actually adding some light to the outer corner as well. But that's okay. I'm trying to fit as many of these shadows on my lids as possible just so you guys can see them, even if this is not really necessarily how I would use them on a regular basis. Alrighty, interesting. So yeah, this is definitely quite shiny. So I would say that probably in general, even though this looks like one of the deepest shades in pan, you probably don't want to use this as a deepening shade just because it does catch the light very nicely. So more of kind of an all over lid shade, but that's okay. We're just gonna keep rolling with it today. So I'm feeling a little bit of a neutral look today. So next up, I'm gonna go into Enigma over here and just kind of pull this over the center of the lid and see how that looks. I really like Enigma and Divine Mink together. They're somewhat similar shades in terms of having that kind of brownish, grayish silver going for them, but Enigma is obviously much lighter, and so it just goes together quite nicely. Next up, I'm going to bring Sinful to this party just because I find this to be such an intriguing shade. So I'm going to put this in the inner third of the eyelid. Alrighty, so this is a much more monochromatic look than what I was originally going for, but it's okay, let's keep rolling with it. So I'm going to try to bring a little bit more color to the party by just going into Underworld with my Wayne Goss number 4 and layering that on the outer portion of the eye, since I think this has a little bit less reflectivity to it, so it might be better as a shade that brings just a little bit of a shadow. Okay, yeah, so this definitely has less shine than Divine Mink. It's bringing in some of that nice blue shade. Alrighty, so I am very sketched out by Lapis Luxury, but in the interest of just showing you guys how the shade looks, I'm probably gonna wash my eyes right after this, but I'm gonna take a little bit of this and just put it in the area where Underworld meets Enigma, just so you guys can see that shade. Oh, it's such a pretty shade. I really wish this didn't arrive with these bubbles. Oh, so pretty. And I feel like it just ties the look together so nicely. Wow, this is a really fascinating eye look that I have on today. Really not what I normally go for, but I'm digging it, and I'm using a lot of these shadows, so hopefully this is helpful for you guys to see them on the lids. So cleaning off my Wayne Goss number 4 brush now, I'm just gonna take a little bit more blue blood because I feel like that kind of got lost. And I'm just gonna add that back to the crease area, just sort of blending that upwards and outwards. Alrighty, so now for the lower lash line. So I would typically want to kind of match my eyelid on my lower lash line, especially in such a dramatic smoky look like this. But I do want to just show you guys all of the shades. So we're going to kind of take a deviation and use these 3 sunset inspired colors on my lower lash line and hope that this look doesn't just look completely clownish at the end of the day. So first off, I'm going to take Hedonistic and just kind of run this all over the outer 2/3 of the eye. And I'll probably put some blue blood on the outer third just to tie things in a little bit with the upper lash line. So you can see this is a really pretty shade that is actually quite a bit more unique than it looks in pan. Like, you definitely mostly get the red, but you also get a little bit of orange and a little bit of pink, kind of depending on the angle that you look at it from. Cleaning off that brush, I'm going to take Inferno and then put that in the inner third. And this is just a really pretty peachy satin metallic shade. And now just some blue blood on the outer third to tie everything together a little bit more. Alrighty, so now we just have 2 shades left. We have these 2 gold and silver shades. So I'm going to first take some of Gold Standard and just put it right in the inner corner. Just dab that in. And like I said, this is not a terribly unique shade. I mean, if you're a connoisseur of yellow gold shades, I think this is a really good yellow gold shade. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of yellow golds normally, so I'm not, super excited about the shade, but it is a really nice yellow gold shade. And then to finish off the look, I'm taking my Sonia G Mini Booster into this Sterling shade and just putting this on the brow bone. Wow, okay, I think I took a little bit too much of this, but hey, at least you guys can see that shade really well. And I think Sterling is probably a shade that is better used more kind of all over the lid rather than as a highlight shade. So there we are, all of the shades on my lids. I know this is a pretty intense look, not how I would necessarily recommend using this palette, but hopefully seeing all of these shadows in action is helpful for you guys as you're considering this palette. So now I'm gonna go off and finish the rest of my face and then be back with my initial review of this palette. Alrighty, so here we are with the final look, and in case you guys are curious what I have on, I have the M Cosmetics Venetian Rose Blush, which if you haven't checked out my video for, definitely check this out. And then I also have the Pat McGrath highlighter in Divine Rose. So not necessarily the highlighter shade that goes the best with this look, but I think it's a nice complement to the Venetian Rose Blush, and also I just love that highlighter so much and love wearing it on a daily basis. And then for lips, I have my Pat McGrath lip liner in the shade Structure and my Natasha Denona I Need a Nude in Sammy. So with the whole look done, I would actually say I really enjoy this eye look a lot more than I thought I would, because there's so many different colors going on my lids right now. We have yellow, we have green, we have blue, we have red. Really, it's just everything happening at once. But I think overall the look is actually quite cohesive, surprisingly, and has those pops of color, but is also just kind of a more smoky look that doesn't necessarily seem like your look is going in all sorts of directions, because I don't really think of this palette as having a single cohesive color story so much as having just a lot of different directions that you can go in paired with other palettes. So I'm glad that even if you put everything together in one look, it still looks pretty solid despite that. And also I would say, after having put those mattes from Subliminal on underneath as a foundation, the metallics in this palette really blended out beautifully, and I don't feel like there's anything lacking in this look, despite the fact that the palette itself doesn't have matching mattes. So overall, I would say I'm quite a fan of this palette. I wouldn't say that I like it as much as my other Mothership palettes, at least for now, just because I am such a sucker for Pat McGrath's special Blitz Astral shades, which this palette doesn't have any of. But this palette does definitely excel just in its versatility. Like, for example, I think you could do a really gorgeous sort of warm toned sunset inspired look if you concentrated more on Hedonistic, Gold Standard, and Inferno. So if you just basically took the shades I have on my lower lash line and built a look around that, that would be really great for the summertime. And then there's obviously all of these bluish, lilac-y, minky shades that I think go really well together for more of a cool toned look. And I think you could especially bring in Sterling into a more prominent place in the look and have it be a really gorgeous cool toned look. And then if you want to go a little bit more neutral but still very sultry and smoky, then I think bringing some of these kind of minky brownish shades like Enigma, Divine Mink, and Blue Blood together, I think that can also create a really beautiful, dramatic, but still kind of neutral look. So overall, I think there's a bunch of different directions you can go with this palette, and especially if you pair this with other Pat McGrath palettes, I think this can be a really gorgeous supplement to your Pat McGrath collection. As I said earlier in this video, I don't think this is necessarily a good palette to start out with if you haven't collected many Pat McGrath palettes, just because I think what really tends to stand out in terms of Pat McGrath's Mothership palettes are these sorts of 4 Blitz Astral shades that she typically includes. And also I think that most of her palettes do have more of that cohesive color story. So just again, looking at Subliminal, for instance, you have all of these matte shades, these sort of satin metallics, more shiny metallics, and then these Blitz Astral shades. So you can really build a wide variety of very cohesive color story looks. Whereas I think with this palette, it's best paired with another Mothership palette. And in fact, actually, as I'm looking at this eyeshadow look, even though it is very dramatic, I am curious how it would look with one of her glitter toppers. So since I already have Subliminal here, let me just go ahead and try adding a little bit of Astral White just to the middle part and see how that looks. Ooh, can you guys see that additional blue shine that brought to this look? Wow. Okay, actually, I'm glad I'm doing this because this is really pretty. And you can see there's just that additional light as well that comes from that shadow. So let me just go ahead and refine the edges a little bit. Alrighty, so here we are with the look that has one of those Blitz Astral glitter toppers, and as you guys can see, I think it just adds a little bit more dimension, a little bit more pizzazz to this look. So it was looking pretty fine before that, but I think this just brings it to that special Pat McGrath level. So in any case, my overall conclusion is I do really like this palette. I definitely want this in my collection. I'm still on the fence as to whether I want to get a replacement right now and have it in my collection immediately, or whether I want to return it and wait a little while until hopefully they have sold out of this batch that has these bubbles in the palette. Again, to me, that still is kind of frustrating that this palette arrived with those sorts of bubbles in the first place, because I was super excited to just, you know, have this in my collection now, and that kind of freaked me out, especially since they told me this is actually normal. Like, it's not something I would expect from such a high-end luxurious brand as Pat McGrath. But all things considered, I am digging the look that I created today and digging all of these gorgeous shadows. Let me know down below what you guys think about the Decadence palette, if you guys have tried it. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!